After 43 years of marriage, Ruth and Walter Dawson watched their life's work turn to ash in a single afternoon. The fire that took their mountain cabin also took Walter's hope, leaving him to care for his wheelchair-bound wife with winter approaching and nowhere to turn. In the Colorado wilderness of 1892, most folks would have given up. But when gruff mountain man Conrad McKenzie found them shivering in the ruins, something stirred in his heart that he thought had died years ago. Conrad had been living alone for 15 years, avoiding people and nursing old wounds. Taking in strangers went against everything he believed about staying hidden. What happened next would change all three of their lives. Conrad's cabin became more than shelter. It became a place where broken people could heal. But Conrad was hiding secrets that could put them all in danger. Would his past catch up to them before they found their second chance at family? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Colorado Rockies, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose. At nearly 10,000 feet above sea level, the thin air carried the crisp promise of another brutal winter, and the aspens had long since shed their golden leaves, leaving skeletal branches reaching toward an indifferent sky. Ruth Dawson sat in her weathered wooden wheelchair, her gnarled hands folded carefully over a patchwork quilt that had somehow survived the flames. At 68, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had weathered countless storms, both literal and figurative. Her silver hair, once golden like summer wheat, was pinned back in a simple bun, and her blue eyes, still sharp despite her years, surveyed the charred remains of what had been their home for over 2 decades. 43 years, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the mountain wind. 43 years, and it's all gone in an afternoon. Walter Dawson, her husband of those same 43 years, stood beside her with shoulders that had once been broad and strong, but now curved slightly under the weight of time and recent loss. At 71, his weathered face told the story of a life spent outdoors, deep lines carved by sun and wind, hands marked by decades of honest labor. His thick grey beard, which Ruth had always said made him look distinguished, now seemed to emphasize the weariness in his brown eyes. Not all of it. "My dear," Walter said gently, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "You're still here. That's all that truly matters to me." The fire had started 3 days ago when a spark from their wood stove caught the dried timber of their cabin walls. In their younger days, they might have fought it more effectively, but age had slowed their reflexes, and Ruth's condition, she had been confined to the wheelchair for 5 years now after a fall that damaged her spine, had made evacuation their only option. They had managed to save very little, Ruth's wedding ring still gleaming on her finger, a small wooden box containing a few precious photographs, Walter's pocket watch, though it had stopped working sometime during their frantic escape, and the quilt that now provided their only warmth. Their nearest neighbors lived 15 miles down the mountain, accessible only by a winding trail that Walter wasn't sure he could manage in his current state, especially not while pushing Ruth's wheelchair through the rough terrain. The October snow had already begun to fall, and everyone in these parts knew that winter came early and stayed late at this elevation. "We can't stay here much longer," Walter said, though his voice lacked conviction. "The weather's turning, and we don't have proper shelter." Ruth reached up and covered his hand with her own, feeling the familiar calluses from decades of carpentry and farming. "Where would we go, my love? We have no money, no relatives within 100 miles, and winter is already knocking at our door." It was true, and they both knew it. Their savings had been modest, kept in a tin box that was now nothing but melted metal somewhere in the ruins. Their children, a son and daughter, lived back east and had their own families to care for. Even if they could somehow get word to them, the journey would be treacherous, and Ruth wasn't sure she could survive such a trip. As if summoned by their desperation, a figure emerged from the tree line about 50 yards away. Both Ruth and Walter tensed, unsure whether they were seeing salvation or threat. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the confident stride of someone completely at home in the wilderness. He wore a thick brown coat made of what looked like elk hide, and his grey-streaked beard reached nearly to his chest. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but they could see his eyes scanning their campsite with the careful attention of someone long accustomed to evaluating potential dangers. Conrad McKenzie had been making his morning rounds, checking the snares he'd set for rabbits and ensuring that no predators had wandered too close to his cabin when he'd spotted the smoke. Now, seeing the elderly couple huddled in the ruins of their home, he felt an unwelcome stirring of something he'd spent 15 years trying to bury: compassion for fellow human beings. At 55, Conrad had lived more than half his life in complete solitude, high in the mountains where most people feared to venture. His cabin, built entirely with his own hands from trees he'd felled himself, sat in a natural clearing about 2 miles from where he now stood. It was sturdy and warm, designed to withstand the fierce mountain winters, with thick log walls, a stone fireplace, and windows that faced south to catch what little sun the altitude allowed. Conrad had not spoken to another human being in over a year, and before that, his conversations had been limited to brief encounters with trappers or the occasional lost traveler. He preferred it that way. People brought complications, questions, emotions he had no desire to revisit. Yet something about the sight of the elderly woman in her wheelchair, her husband standing protectively beside her, made him hesitate instead of simply melting back into the forest as he normally would. "Good morning," he called out, his voice rusty from disuse but carrying clearly in the thin air. Walter straightened, instinctively moving closer to Ruth's wheelchair. "Morning," he replied cautiously. "I'm Walter Dawson, and this is my wife, Ruth. Our cabin burned down 3 days ago." Conrad nodded, his practiced eyes taking in their situation with the efficiency of someone who had learned to assess threats and opportunities quickly. He could see they had little food, inadequate shelter, and were clearly unprepared for mountain survival in winter conditions. The woman was obviously unable to walk, which would make any journey down the mountain extremely difficult. They were, he realized, likely to die if left to their own devices. "Conrad McKenzie," he said simply, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of politeness his mother had taught him decades ago. "I live about 2 miles north of here." Ruth studied the mountain man's face, noting the intelligence in his green eyes despite his rough appearance. There was something about him that reminded her of Walter in his younger days, a competence and quiet strength that came from years of depending on oneself. But there was also a loneliness there, a carefully maintained distance that spoke of someone who had deliberately chosen isolation. "Mr. McKenzie," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent of someone who had received a proper education. "I don't suppose you know of any shelter nearby where we might wait out the winter. We're afraid we're rather poorly equipped for survival at the moment." Conrad was struck by her dignity. Most people in her situation would have been begging, pleading, or demanding help. Instead, she spoke as if she were inquiring about accommodations at a hotel. It had been so long since he'd encountered genuine class and breeding that he found himself momentarily off balance. "The nearest town is Copper Creek, about 25 miles down the mountain," he said. "Trail's rough, and it'll be impassable once the heavy snows start." That could be any day now. Walter felt his heart sink. 25 miles might as well have been 1,000, given Ruth's condition and their lack of supplies. "I see," he said quietly. Conrad found himself in an unfamiliar position. Every instinct told him to wish them well and disappear back into the forest. He had his own survival to consider, and taking in 2 elderly people, one of them disabled, was the kind of complication he had specifically chosen mountain life to avoid. His cabin was designed for 1 person, his food stores calculated for a single mouth to feed, his entire existence predicated on solitude and self-sufficiency. Yet as he looked at Ruth's brave smile and Walter's protective stance, memories stirred that he had spent years trying to suppress. Memories of other people who had needed help, of times when he had failed to provide it, of consequences that had driven him to this mountaintop in the first place. "My cabin's got room," he heard himself saying, the words surprising him as much as they seemed to surprise the elderly couple. "It's not fancy, but it's warm and dry. You could stay until spring if needed." Ruth and Walter exchanged a look that contained 43 years of wordless communication. They had no other options, but they also sensed something trustworthy in this rough mountain man, despite his obvious reluctance to get involved. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Mackenzie," Ruth said carefully. "We wouldn't want to impose, but if you're certain—" "I wouldn't have offered if I wasn't certain," Conrad interrupted, though his tone wasn't harsh. "Weather's going to turn nasty soon. We should get moving." As Conrad began gathering their meager possessions, he discovered a beautifully carved wooden chess set among Walter's few saved items. The pieces were intricate, each one a small work of art, and the board itself was made from alternating light and dark wood squares that had been fitted together with master craftsmanship. "You made this?" Conrad asked, holding up one of the knights. Walter nodded proudly. "Took me the better part of a winter. Ruth taught me to play when we were first married. She's quite good, beats me more often than not." Conrad examined the piece more closely, noting the fine detail work and the smooth finish. "It's beautiful craftsmanship. Been a long time since I've seen work this fine." For the first time since the fire, Walter felt a spark of his old pride. "Do you play?" "Used to," Conrad replied, carefully wrapping the chess set in a piece of cloth. "Been a while." As they prepared for the journey to Conrad's cabin, Ruth found herself studying their unlikely rescuer. There was clearly more to Conrad McKenzie than met the eye. His clothes, while practical and well-worn, were of good quality. His speech, when he chose to use it, was educated and grammatically correct. And the way he handled Walter's chess set suggested a familiarity with finer things that seemed at odds with his mountain man appearance. The journey to Conrad's cabin took nearly 3 hours, with Conrad and Walter taking turns pushing Ruth's wheelchair over the uneven terrain. Conrad had fashioned a makeshift stretcher using branches and his coat, allowing them to carry the wheelchair when the path became too rough for wheels. Ruth never complained, though Walter could see the journey was taxing her strength. Conrad's cabin, when they finally reached it, was a revelation. From the outside, it looked like a typical mountain dwelling. Solid log construction with a stone chimney and a covered porch. But inside, it was clear that its builder had taken great care with both function and form. The main room featured a large stone fireplace, handmade furniture that showed considerable skill, and shelves lined with more books than either Ruth or Walter had expected to find in the middle of nowhere. "You read a great deal, Mr. Mackenzie," Ruth observed, noting volumes of philosophy, history, and literature among the practical texts on farming, hunting, and mountain survival. "Helps pass the winter evenings," Conrad replied. Busying himself with starting a fire in the fireplace, Walter was examining the craftsmanship of the cabin's construction. The logs were perfectly fitted. The chinking was expertly done, and the overall design showed both practicality and aesthetic sense. "You built all this yourself?" "Had plenty of time," Conrad said simply. As the fire began to warm the cabin, Ruth felt something she hadn't experienced since before the flames consumed their home, a sense of security. Conrad might be taciturn and obviously uncomfortable with company, but she could see the care he had taken in creating this refuge. A man who would invest such effort in making a beautiful as well as functional home was someone who understood the importance of creating sanctuary. "Mr. Mackenzie," she said, as Conrad began preparing a simple meal, "we can't thank you enough for your kindness. We know this must be an imposition." "It's Conrad," he interrupted gently, "and you're not an imposition. Just temporary neighbors, that's all." But as Conrad watched Ruth and Walter settle into his carefully ordered space, he wondered if he was telling the truth. Something about their presence felt less temporary than he wanted to admit, and that realization both comforted and terrified him in ways he wasn't prepared to examine. Outside, the first heavy snow of the season began to fall, sealing them all in together until spring. The first night in Conrad's cabin passed quietly, but not peacefully. Ruth barely slept, her body aching from the journey, and her mind racing with the enormity of their situation. She lay on the narrow cot Conrad had hastily assembled near the fireplace, listening to Walter's labored breathing from his makeshift bed across the room and the occasional creak of floorboards as their host moved restlessly in the loft above. By dawn, Ruth's condition had worsened considerably. The exposure to cold, the stress of losing their home, and the physical demands of the journey had taken a greater toll than she had let on. When Walter bent to help her sit up, he found her skin pale and clammy, her breathing shallow and rapid. "Ruth?" Walter's voice cracked with worry. "Ruth, can you hear me?" She opened her eyes, but they seemed unfocused, distant. For a terrifying moment, Walter thought she might be slipping away from him entirely. They had weathered so much together. The challenges of frontier life, the accident that confined her to the wheelchair, the gradual decline that comes with aging. But he had always believed they would face whatever came next together. Conrad appeared at the top of the ladder leading to his loft, awakened by the urgency in Walter's voice. He took one look at Ruth and was down the ladder immediately, his mountain survival instincts kicking in. He had seen exposure sickness before, and he recognized the signs. "She needs warmth, and she needs it now," Conrad said, his voice calm but commanding. "Help me move her closer to the fire." Together, they repositioned Ruth's cot directly in front of the fireplace. Conrad built up the fire until it blazed hot and bright, then began heating water for tea. His movements were efficient, purposeful, and Walter found himself grateful for the mountain man's obvious competence in crisis situations. "Ruth," Walter said softly, taking her cold hand in both of his warm ones. "Stay with me, my dear. We're safe now. We're warm." For hours, Ruth drifted in and out of consciousness while Conrad and Walter took turns monitoring her condition. Conrad brewed tea from herbs he had gathered and dried during the summer, explaining quietly that mountain folk had used these remedies for generations. Walter spooned the warm liquid between Ruth's lips, speaking to her constantly, sharing memories of their early years together, their children, the dreams they had built and lived. It was during one of these one-sided conversations that Ruth's eyes suddenly focused clearly on Walter's face. She squeezed his hand with surprising strength and whispered, "The pocket watch." Walter reached for the timepiece that had been his father's, then his, and which he had hoped to pass down to his grandson someday. The fire had stopped its mechanism, freezing the hands at 3:17, the approximate time their old life had ended in flames. "It's stopped," Walter said gently. "Like time itself," Ruth murmured, her voice growing stronger. "Everything stopped when the fire came. But we're still here, Walter. We're still here." Those were the first coherent words she had spoken since they had fled their burning cabin, and Walter felt tears of relief sliding down his weathered cheeks. Conrad, who had been quietly preparing more tea, paused in his work, struck by the simple profundity of her observation. Over the next several hours, Ruth's condition stabilized. The color returned to her cheeks, her breathing deepened, and she began to take notice of her surroundings. She studied Conrad's cabin with the careful attention of a woman who had managed a household for over 4 decades, noting the cleanliness, the organization, the clear care he had taken in creating a functional living space. "This is a beautiful home you've built." "Conrad," she said when he brought her another cup of herbal tea. The use of his first name surprised him. Most people who knew his name at all still called him Mackenzie, or simply the Mountain Man. Hearing his given name spoken with Ruth's gentle formality felt unexpectedly intimate. "It suits my needs," he replied, uncomfortable with the praise. "It suits them very well indeed," Ruth continued. "You've created something that's both practical and beautiful. That takes wisdom." Conrad found himself genuinely flustered by her observation. He had indeed tried to make his cabin beautiful as well as functional, but he had never expected anyone else to notice or appreciate that effort. Beauty had seemed like a luxury he couldn't afford when he first fled to the mountains, but over the years, he had discovered that surrounding himself with things that pleased the eye helped combat the loneliness that sometimes threatened to overwhelm him during the long winter months. Walter, meanwhile, was struggling with his own crisis. Seeing Ruth so close to death had forced him to confront something he had been trying to deny: his own declining health. The journey to Conrad's cabin had exhausted him more than he cared to admit, and the night of worry over Ruth had left him feeling weak and shaky. At 71, he was no longer the strong man who had built their cabin with his own hands, who had protected and provided for his family through decades of frontier challenges. "Conrad," Walter said quietly when Ruth had dozed off again, "I need to ask something of you, and I know it's not fair." Conrad paused in his work of organizing their few possessions, sensing the gravity in Walter's tone. "If something happens to me," Walter continued, "Ruth will need care. She's stronger than she looks, but she can't survive alone, especially not up here. I know it's a terrible thing to ask of a stranger." "You're not strangers anymore," Conrad interrupted, surprising himself with the words. "You're under my roof, eating my food, warming yourselves at my fire. That makes you family, mountain style." Walter felt a surge of gratitude so intense it nearly overwhelmed him. In all his years, he had rarely encountered such straightforward generosity, especially from someone who clearly valued his solitude. "Thank you," Walter said simply. "That means more than I can express." Conrad nodded curtly, uncomfortable with emotional displays, but moved despite himself by Walter's obvious relief. The truth was, something had already shifted in his carefully ordered world. The presence of Ruth and Walter had awakened feelings he had thought permanently buried: the satisfaction of caring for others, the warmth of shared meals and conversation, the simple pleasure of being needed. As evening approached, Conrad established what he hoped would become comfortable routines for all of them. He had moved his own bedroll down from the loft to give Ruth and Walter more privacy, setting up a sleeping area near his bookshelves. Ruth would keep the cot by the fireplace, both for warmth and because it would be easier for her to access from her wheelchair. For dinner, Conrad prepared a simple but nourishing meal of venison stew and biscuits. Ruth insisted on helping despite her weakness, directing the men in proper seasoning and sharing techniques her mother had taught her decades ago in Ohio. It was the first real meal any of them had enjoyed since the fire, and the act of preparing it together felt surprisingly natural. "You're an excellent cook, Conrad," Ruth said as they finished eating. "A man who can make biscuits this light has clearly mastered the domestic arts." "Had to learn," Conrad replied. "Mountain doesn't provide restaurant service," Walter chuckled, the first time Conrad had heard him laugh, and Ruth smiled warmly. For a moment, the cabin felt less like a refuge for desperate people, and more like a home where people who cared about each other gathered to share their evening meal. But as they prepared for their second night together, each of them was acutely aware that this arrangement was both temporary and tenuous. Conrad had opened his door to them in crisis, but he had also made clear that this was a short-term solution. Walter was grateful but worried about imposing on their host's obvious discomfort with company. And Ruth, despite her gratitude, sensed undercurrents in Conrad's behavior that suggested he was harboring secrets that might complicate their sanctuary. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them all that winter was coming whether they were ready or not. Inside, three people who had been strangers just days ago settled into an uneasy but hopeful coexistence, each wondering what the long months ahead might bring. Walter's pocket watch sat silent on the mantelpiece, its hands still frozen at 3:17, a reminder that sometimes time stops completely before it can begin again. Dawn came late at their elevation, filtered through clouds that promised more snow. Conrad woke first, as was his habit, and quietly stoked the fire back to life before Ruth and Walter stirred. The cabin had developed a comfortable warmth during the night, and he found himself pleased that his guests had slept peacefully. Ruth woke to the smell of coffee brewing and bacon frying, luxuries she hadn't expected in their current circumstances. She watched Conrad move efficiently around his kitchen area, noting how he seemed to anticipate every need without wasted motion. It was the kind of competence that came from years of self-reliance, but also something more, a natural consideration for others that suggested this wasn't the first time he had cared for people. "Good morning, Conrad," she said softly, not wanting to wake Walter just yet. "Morning, Ruth. How are you feeling?" The casual use of first names felt natural now, as if they had been acquainted for years rather than days. "Much better, thank you. Strong enough to be useful, I hope." Conrad glanced at her wheelchair, positioned beside the cot where she could transfer herself easily. "Can you manage eggs? My chickens are still laying despite the cold." Ruth's face brightened considerably. She hadn't realized Conrad kept chickens, and the prospect of fresh eggs felt like an unexpected luxury. "I'd be delighted." "It's been too long since I've cooked a proper breakfast." Walter woke to find Ruth already transferred to her wheelchair, working alongside Conrad at the small table he used for food preparation. The sight of his wife engaged in the domestic routines she had always loved brought tears to his eyes. Since the fire, he had worried that she might never find pleasure in simple activities again. "What can I do to help?" Walter asked, stretching muscles that protested after a night on an unfamiliar bed. "Conrad has some repairs that need attention," Ruth said, cracking eggs into a bowl with practiced precision. "The shutter on the east window sticks, and one of the chairs has a wobbly leg." Walter looked surprised. "You've catalogued household repairs already?" Ruth smiled. "Old habits. A woman notices these things." Conrad found himself oddly touched that Ruth had taken note of his cabin's minor imperfections and was already thinking of ways to improve their shared space. Most guests would have simply accepted things as they found them. After breakfast, they naturally fell into a division of labor that played to each person's strengths. Ruth, despite being confined to her wheelchair, proved remarkably capable of managing cooking tasks from a seated position. Her recipe book, water-damaged but still legible, had survived the fire and contained decades of accumulated knowledge about feeding a family well on limited resources. "This recipe for cornbread uses honey instead of sugar," Ruth explained as she mixed ingredients in one of Conrad's wooden bowls. "My grandmother's recipe from Kentucky. The honey keeps it moist longer, which is important when you can't get to town often." Conrad watched her work, impressed by her efficiency and the obvious pleasure she took in the task. It had been years since anyone had cooked in his kitchen besides himself, and he found the transformation of his space both comfortable and slightly unsettling. Meanwhile, Walter examined the repairs Ruth had identified, his experienced eye quickly assessing what needed to be done. The furniture repairs were simple enough, requiring only basic tools and techniques he had mastered decades ago. But the window shutter presented a more interesting challenge. It had warped slightly over time, and fixing it properly would require careful planning and precise measurements. "Mind if I take a look at your workshop?" Walter asked. "I'll need to see what tools you have available." Conrad's workshop occupied a lean-to addition he had built onto the back of the cabin. It was well organized and contained a surprising variety of high-quality tools, many of them showing the kind of care that indicated their owner was skilled in their use. Walter ran his hands over a beautifully maintained set of chisels, noting their perfect sharpness and the custom handles that had been shaped to fit Conrad's grip exactly. "You do fine work," Walter said appreciatively. "These tools are maintained like a craftsman's. Man's got to have good tools if he expects to build anything worth having," Conrad replied. But Walter could hear the pleasure in his voice at having his workmanship recognized. They spent the morning working side by side, Conrad showing Walter where he kept different supplies, while Walter shared techniques he had developed over decades of carpentry and general repairs. There was an easy camaraderie between them, the kind that develops between competent men who respect each other's skills. "You built this entire cabin yourself?" Walter asked as he worked on the warped shutter, every bit of it. "Took the better part of 2 years, working mostly in the summers. Had to learn as I went for some of it." Walter examined the joint work more closely, noting the precision of the cuts and the way everything fit together perfectly, despite Conrad's claim of learning as he worked. "You had good teachers, or natural talent, or both?" Conrad paused in his work, and Walter sensed he had touched on something significant. "Had some instruction early on. Long time ago. Meanwhile, Ruth had transformed Conrad's simple kitchen into something approaching what she had always considered a proper cooking space. She had reorganized his supplies for easier access, identified ingredients that would benefit from different storage methods, and begun preparing a more elaborate lunch than Conrad typically bothered with. "Conrad," she called from her position at the table, "do you have any herbs growing nearby? I noticed some dried ones hanging by the window, but fresh would be even better for this stew. There's a patch of wild onions about 50 yards south of here, and some late sage if you know what to look for." "But the ground's getting hard and it's cold. I'll bundle up," Ruth interrupted firmly. "I haven't been outside since we arrived, and I need the air. Besides, I know herbs. My mother taught me which ones to gather and how to prepare them properly." Both men looked uncertain about Ruth venturing out in her wheelchair, but she was already reaching for the heavy coat Conrad had provided. There was something in her manner that brooked no argument, a quiet determination that reminded them both that she had survived frontier life for over 4 decades before the fire. "I'll come with you," Walter said quickly. "We'll all go," Conrad added. "I can show you the best spots, and you can teach me which plants you recognize. Always useful to learn from someone with experience." The expedition to gather herbs became their first real shared adventure as a group. Ruth proved remarkably adept at maneuvering her wheelchair over rough ground, and her knowledge of useful plants exceeded even Conrad's considerable expertise. She identified several species he had overlooked, explaining their culinary and medicinal properties with the confidence of someone who had relied on such knowledge for practical purposes. "This one's good for settling stomach troubles," she said, carefully harvesting leaves from a plant growing near a fallen log. "And this," she pointed to another variety, "makes a tea that helps with winter coughs." Conrad found himself genuinely impressed by her knowledge and her matter-of-fact competence, despite her physical limitations. Ruth, for her part, felt more like herself than she had since the fire, engaged in activities that connected her to skills and knowledge she had feared losing. As they returned to the cabin with their harvest, all three felt a subtle shift in their dynamic. They were no longer host and desperate guests, but something closer to partners in the shared enterprise of making a life together through the coming winter. That evening, the improved dinner Ruth prepared from their gathered herbs and Conrad's supplies seemed to seal their new arrangement. They were, by necessity and growing choice, becoming a family of sorts, bound together by circumstance, but held together by increasing mutual respect and affection. The first major snowstorm of the season arrived 5 days after Ruth and Walter had settled into Conrad's cabin, announcing itself with a howling wind that shook the sturdy log walls and sent snow swirling in thick curtains across the clearing. By morning, 3 feet of fresh powder had transformed the landscape into an unbroken expanse of white that stretched as far as the eye could see. "Well," Conrad said, looking out the window at the transformed world, "that settles the question of whether you folks will make it down the mountain before spring." Walter felt a moment of panic at the finality of Conrad's statement, but Ruth reached over and squeezed his hand reassuringly. "We'll make the best of it," she said calmly, "and perhaps by spring we'll all be sorry to see this arrangement end." Conrad glanced at her sharply, surprised by her suggestion that their cohabitation might become something they would miss rather than simply endure. The truth was, he had found himself enjoying their company more than he cared to admit, but he had assumed that Ruth and Walter were counting the days until they could return to civilization. The storm raged for 3 days, confining them all to the cabin and forcing them to develop rhythms of shared space that would have been awkward under normal circumstances. Instead, they found themselves settling into patterns that felt surprisingly natural. Ruth established herself as the household manager, organizing meals and maintaining order with the same quiet efficiency she had brought to her own home for decades. Walter became Conrad's partner in maintenance and improvement projects, two men working together with an easy collaboration that suggested years of friendship rather than days. Conrad, meanwhile, found himself gradually opening up in ways he hadn't since his self-imposed exile began. On the second day of the storm, he retrieved a battered wooden box from beneath his bed and carefully extracted a tarnished military medal, a cavalry commendation that he held for a long moment before showing it to his companions. "I served in the cavalry for 12 years, he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the wind outside. "Ended up as a sergeant, stationed mostly in Colorado and Wyoming territories." Ruth and Walter exchanged a glance, both recognizing that Conrad was sharing something significant. They waited patiently for him to continue, sensing that pushing for details would cause him to retreat back into silence. "Why did you leave the service?" Walter asked gently. Conrad's jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment they thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one required careful consideration. "There was a disagreement with my commanding officer about the treatment of some Indian families we encountered. I felt we had a duty to protect non-combatants." He felt differently. Conrad paused, turning the medal over in his weathered hands. "When I refused to follow orders I considered immoral, things became complicated." Ruth could hear volumes of pain and regret in Conrad's carefully neutral tone. She had lived long enough to recognize the sound of a man carrying guilt over decisions made in impossible circumstances. "You did what you believed was right," she said softly. "That takes courage." "Courage," Conrad repeated bitterly. "My courage. Got good men killed and accomplished nothing except getting me drummed out of the service under circumstances that made it difficult to find work anywhere civilized." Walter leaned forward in his chair, his own experiences with moral complexity giving him insight into Conrad's struggle. "Sometimes doing the right thing costs more than we expect to pay," he said. "Doesn't make it less right." Conrad looked up at him sharply, hearing something in Walter's tone that suggested personal experience with difficult choices. "You sound like you know something about that." Walter nodded slowly. "During the war, I was a field medic with the Colorado Volunteers, saw things, had to make decisions about who could be saved and who couldn't. Still wake up some nights thinking about the ones I couldn't help." The three sat in contemplative silence for a while, the storm raging outside while they each grappled with memories of choices made under pressure, of moral complexities that had no clean resolution. It was Ruth who eventually broke the silence, her voice gentle but firm. "We've all done things we regret, and we've all faced situations where there were no good choices available. What matters is what we choose to do with the time we have left." Over the remaining days of the storm, their conversations deepened considerably. Ruth shared stories of her early married life, the challenges of raising children on the frontier, and the accident that had confined her to the wheelchair. She spoke without self-pity, but her accounts revealed a woman who had faced more adversity than either man had fully realized. "The hardest part wasn't losing the use of my legs," she explained one evening as they sat around the fire. "It was feeling like I'd lost my usefulness. Walter tried to convince me otherwise, but for the longest time I felt like I'd become nothing but a burden." "You've never been a burden," Walter said firmly, his voice thick with emotion. "You've been the strength that kept me going through everything we've faced together." Conrad found himself moved by the obvious depth of their partnership. In his years of solitude, he had sometimes wondered if he had given up too easily on the possibility of sharing his life with someone else. Watching Ruth and Walter navigate their challenges together while maintaining their obvious love and respect for each other, he began to question some of the assumptions he had made about the necessity of isolation. The storm also revealed practical challenges that would need to be addressed during their extended cohabitation. Walter's health showed concerning signs during the physically demanding days of being confined indoors. He tired more easily than before, had occasional episodes of shortness of breath, and seemed to struggle with tasks that would normally have been routine for him. Ruth noticed these changes with growing concern, though she was careful not to voice her worries in ways that might make Walter feel diminished. Instead, she began quietly adjusting their routines to ensure he had adequate rest while still feeling useful and engaged. Conrad, meanwhile, realized that his carefully calculated food stores would need to be stretched to feed 3 people instead of 1 through the entire winter. It would require careful planning and probably some additional hunting. But it was manageable if they were all prudent about portions and waste. "We'll need to be more careful about supplies," he mentioned one morning as they planned their daily activities. 3 people eat considerably more than 1. "I can help with that," Ruth offered. "I know techniques for making food stretch further, and I'm good at finding ways to use every part of what we have available." As the storm finally began to clear on the 4th day, all 3 of them found themselves looking forward to getting outside again, but also aware that they had passed some kind of test during their enforced confinement. They had learned to live together without major conflicts, had begun to genuinely care about each other's well-being, and had started to develop the kind of mutual dependence that characterizes real families. When Conrad opened the door to assess the storm's aftermath, the brilliant sunshine reflecting off the fresh snow was almost blinding. But more significant than the changed landscape was the realization that the 3 people emerging from the cabin were no longer the same individuals who had entered it days earlier. They had become something new together, a chosen family bound by circumstance, but held together by growing affection and mutual respect. The weeks following the storm settled into a rhythm that surprised all 3 residents of Conrad's cabin with its natural comfort. November brought shorter days and deeper cold, but inside their shared refuge, warmth and purpose flourished in ways none of them had anticipated. Conrad began each morning with his traditional survey of the perimeter, checking snares and ensuring no predators had ventured too close during the night. But now Walter accompanied him on these rounds, the older man's keen eye for detail proving valuable in spotting signs that Conrad might have missed. Walter's knowledge of tracking, learned during his youth in Ohio, complemented Conrad's mountain expertise perfectly. "There," Walter pointed to barely visible marks in the snow near the chicken coop. "Fox tracks may be 2 nights old. He's been watching your birds." Conrad studied the tracks, impressed by Walter's ability to read the subtle signs. "You're right. I'll need to reinforce the coop before he gets bold enough to try something." These morning expeditions became a cornerstone of their developing friendship. Away from the cabin, with just the mountain silence and their shared vigilance, both men found it easier to talk about subjects that might have seemed too personal in Ruth's presence. "Conrad," Walter said one morning as they checked the rabbit snares, "I need to tell you something, and I'd appreciate it if you'd keep it between us for now." Conrad paused in his examination of an empty snare, hearing the gravity in Walter's tone. "Go ahead. I think my heart's failing." Walter's voice was matter-of-fact, but Conrad could hear the fear underneath. "I've been having episodes. Shortness of breath, chest pain, weakness that comes on sudden-like. I don't want Ruth to know how bad it's getting." Conrad felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "How long has this been going on?" "Started before the fire, but it's gotten worse since. The stress, maybe, or just age catching up with me." Walter adjusted his woolen scarf, avoiding Conrad's eyes. "Point is, if something happens to me, Ruth's going to need someone to look after her. I know it's not what you signed up for when you took us in, but—" "Stop!" Conrad interrupted firmly. "Ruth's not going to be alone no matter what happens. You have my word on that." Walter felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying. "Thank you," he said simply. Meanwhile, Ruth had begun transforming Conrad's sparse cabin into something approaching a proper home. She started with small touches, arranging his few books more pleasingly on their shelves, adding dried flowers from her herb-gathering expeditions, organizing his kitchen supplies for greater efficiency. But her most significant project was her embroidery work. Using thread, she had painstakingly unraveled from a damaged petticoat that had survived the fire. Ruth began creating delicate needlework on pieces of fabric Conrad had provided. Her embroidery hoop A delicate wooden frame that had belonged to her mother held work that transformed simple cloth into something beautiful and personal. "What are you making?" Conrad asked one evening, watching her fingers move with practiced precision. "Table runners," Ruth replied, holding up her work to catch the firelight. "And maybe some curtains for the windows, if I can manage enough fabric. A home needs beauty as well as function." Conrad examined the intricate stitching, tiny flowers and vines that seemed to grow across the fabric under Ruth's patient guidance. The work was exquisite, far finer than anything he had seen since leaving the civilized world years ago. "It's beautiful," he said, and meant it. "You're very talented." Ruth smiled, pleased by his appreciation. "My mother insisted that every young woman should know how to make a home lovely as well as comfortable. I always thought it was old-fashioned nonsense until I married Walter and realized how much difference these small graces make." As November progressed, their evening conversations became increasingly intimate and revelatory. They had established a routine of gathering around the fireplace after supper, sometimes playing chess on Walter's beautiful carved set, sometimes simply talking while Ruth worked on her embroidery and the men tended various maintenance tasks. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Ruth shared the story of her accident, the fall that had changed the entire trajectory of their later years. "I was 58 when it happened," she said, her needle moving steadily through the fabric, "helping Walter repair the roof of our barn. I'd climbed up and down that ladder 100 times before, but that day something went wrong. Maybe I was tired, maybe distracted. I fell backward and hit the ground so hard it drove all the breath from my body." Walter's face tightened with remembered anguish. "Worst day of my life, seeing her lying there so still. I thought I'd lost her. The doctor in town said I was lucky to be alive, but I didn't feel lucky for a long time after that. Couldn't walk, couldn't manage the household the way I was used to, couldn't even help Walter with the garden work that had always been my domain." Ruth paused in her stitching, her expression growing distant. "I felt like I'd become useless, like I was nothing but an obligation Walter had to bear." Conrad looked up from the knife he was sharpening. "But you adapted," Ruth nodded slowly. "Eventually, Walter made me a kitchen workspace I could manage from the wheelchair, built raised garden beds I could tend from a sitting position, reorganized our whole life so I could still contribute. But it took time to accept that being different didn't mean being less valuable." "You're one of the strongest people I've ever met," Conrad said quietly. "Physical limitations don't change that." The conversation was interrupted by Walter's sharp intake of breath and the clatter of the chess piece he'd been holding falling to the floor. His face had gone pale, and he was pressing his hand to his chest, breathing in short, labored gasps. Ruth was beside him immediately, her wheelchair moving swiftly across the cabin floor. Walter breathed slowly, deep breaths. "Conrad, help me get him to his bed." Together, they helped Walter to his cot, where he gradually recovered his breath and color. But the episode left all three of them shaken, a stark reminder that their mountain sanctuary existed in the shadow of forces they couldn't control. "I'm all right," Walter insisted once his breathing had normalized. "Just got a little winded, that's all." Ruth and Conrad exchanged a meaningful look over his head. They both knew it had been more than simple fatigue, and they both understood that Walter's condition was likely to worsen as the winter progressed. "Maybe we should modify some of our routines," Ruth suggested diplomatically. "Make sure no one overexerts themselves in this altitude and cold." Conrad nodded his agreement, though privately he was already making plans to ensure Walter received the care he would need without having to admit the full extent of his declining health. That night, as the three of them settled into their respective sleeping areas, each carried private worries about the challenges ahead. But they also carried something new and precious, the knowledge that they had become a family in the truest sense, bound not by blood but by choice and mutual commitment to each other's welfare. Outside, the mountain wind howled through the pine trees, but inside Conrad's cabin, three people who had found each other in their hour of greatest need slept peacefully, watched over by the steady warmth of their shared fire. December arrived with a ferocity that tested even Conrad's mountain-tested cabin. The temperatures dropped so low that ice formed on the inside of the windows despite the constant fire, and the snow piled so high against the walls that they had to dig tunnels to reach the chicken coop and woodshed. But inside their refuge, a different kind of warmth was growing. Walter had begun carving again, using a set of well-worn tools he had retrieved from his few salvaged possessions. His arthritis made the work more difficult than it once had been, but his hands remembered the skills he had developed over decades of woodworking, and he found deep satisfaction in creating beautiful objects from simple pieces of wood. His first project was a set of napkin rings for Ruth, carved from a piece of oak Conrad had provided. Each ring was unique, decorated with delicate patterns of leaves and flowers that complemented Ruth's embroidery work. When he presented them to her during breakfast one morning, her face lit up with the kind of joy that made Walter remember why he had always loved making things with his hands. "They're exquisite." "Walter," she said, running her fingers over the smooth curves and intricate details, "I feel like we're dining in a palace instead of a mountain cabin." Conrad watched their interaction with something approaching envy. He had forgotten what it felt like to create something solely for the pleasure of giving it to someone else, to see his work bring joy to another person. His own craftsmanship had become purely utilitarian during his years of isolation. Everything he made served a practical purpose. Nothing was created simply for beauty or sentiment. "Could you teach me some of those techniques?" Conrad asked Walter later that day as they worked together in the workshop. "I can handle basic carpentry, but those decorative cuts are beyond my current skill." Walter's face brightened with the unmistakable pleasure of an expert asked to share his knowledge. "I'd be delighted. It's been years since I had a proper apprentice." They spent the afternoon working side by side, Walter guiding Conrad's hands as he learned to use the carving tools with the precision required for detailed work. Conrad proved to be an apt student, his natural dexterity and patience serving him well as he gradually mastered the basic techniques. "You have good hands for this work," Walter observed as Conrad successfully completed his first decorative border. "Steady, careful. That's half the battle in fine carving." Conrad found himself unexpectedly moved by Walter's praise. During his military service, his superiors had valued his practical skills, but had never shown appreciation for craftsmanship or artistry. Here, creating something beautiful was not only acceptable, but actively encouraged. Meanwhile, Ruth's health continued to stabilize and even improve. The regular meals, warm shelter, and sense of purpose had restored much of her strength, and she began taking on more complex household projects. Her greatest triumph was modifying Conrad's simple furniture to better accommodate her wheelchair-bound lifestyle. Working with Walter and Conrad, she directed the construction of a kitchen workspace that allowed her to cook efficiently from her chair, complete with lowered counters and strategically placed storage. The project required careful planning and precise measurements, but the result transformed the cabin's functionality significantly. "This is brilliant," Conrad said, as Ruth demonstrated how the new arrangement allowed her to prepare meals with minimal assistance. "I never would have thought of half these modifications." "Necessity breeds innovation," Ruth replied with satisfaction. "I've had 5 years to think about how spaces could be better designed for people with limited mobility. The collaborative nature of these improvements drew all 3 of them closer together. They had moved beyond simply cohabiting to actively creating a shared living space that reflected all of their needs and preferences. The cabin began to feel less like Conrad's solitary refuge and more like a true family home. Their evening routines also evolved and deepened. Ruth had begun reading aloud from Conrad's collection of books, her clear voice bringing new life to stories and poetry that Conrad had only experienced in solitude. Walter proved to have a gift for storytelling, sharing tales from his youth in Ohio and his experiences as a young settler in Colorado that kept them all entertained through the long winter nights. But it was Conrad who surprised them most with his hidden depths. One evening, when Ruth asked about his extensive book collection, He reluctantly revealed that he had once harbored ambitions beyond military service. "I wanted to be a teacher," he admitted, his voice quiet with old regret. "Had planned to finish my service and use my military benefits to attend college back east. Thought I could make a difference. Help young people learn to think clearly and appreciate literature." Ruth looked up from her embroidery, her eyes bright with interest. "What happened to that dream?" Conrad's expression darkened slightly. "The circumstances of my departure from the cavalry made it impossible. No respectable institution would have accepted someone with my military record, and I had no way to explain my side of the story without making things worse." Walter paused in his carving work, struck by the waste Conrad was describing. "You still could be a teacher in a way. There are always young people who could benefit from education, even if it's not in a formal classroom. Up here." Conrad gestured toward the snow-covered wilderness beyond their windows. "Not much call for classical education in the mountains." "Perhaps not," Ruth said thoughtfully, "but there are other ways to share knowledge. And times change. What seems impossible now might become possible later." These conversations revealed aspects of each other's personalities that might never have emerged under normal circumstances. Ruth's quick intelligence and education became more apparent as she engaged with Conrad's books and ideas. Walter's natural wisdom and emotional insight provided balance to their more intellectual discussions. And Conrad's careful thoughtfulness and broad learning proved that his gruff exterior concealed a sophisticated mind hungry for meaningful connection. As December progressed, they all became aware that something significant was developing between them. Not romance, but something equally profound. They were becoming a chosen family, bound together by shared experience and mutual care rather than blood or legal obligation. The realization was both comforting and slightly frightening. Conrad had spent 15 years convinced that solitude was preferable to the complications of human relationships. Walter and Ruth had lost everything they had built together and had expected to spend their remaining years diminished and dependent. Instead, all three found themselves part of something new and unexpectedly fulfilling. "You know," Ruth said one evening as they sat around the fire, "I think we might be building something here that's worth keeping, regardless of what spring brings." Walter nodded his agreement, his hands still busy with his carving. "Some of the best things in life come when you're not looking for them." Conrad looked around at the transformed cabin, Ruth's embroidery gracing the windows, Walter's carved objects adding beauty to every surface, his own books being shared and discussed instead of gathering dust in solitude. For the first time in 15 years, he could imagine a future that included other people, not as complications to be managed, but as essential components of a life worth living. Outside, the mountain winter raged on, but inside their sanctuary, three people who had thought their best days were behind them discovered they were wrong. The blizzard struck without warning on the third week of December, a howling monster of wind and snow that turned the world beyond their windows into a white void. Even Conrad, with his years of mountain experience, was surprised by its sudden ferocity. By evening, the drifts had piled so high against the door that they could barely push it open. "Never seen one come up this fast," Conrad muttered as he struggled to secure the shutters against the driving wind. Usually get more warning. They had just finished their evening meal and were settling in for what promised to be another peaceful night of reading and conversation, when they heard something that made them all freeze, the unmistakable sound of someone pounding on their door. Conrad reached for the rifle he kept, mounted above the fireplace, his face grim. In 15 years of mountain living, no one had ever sought shelter at his cabin during a storm. The location was too remote, the path too difficult for casual travelers to find by accident. "Conrad McKenzie," a voice shouted through the wind. "I know you're in there. Open up before I freeze to death." Conrad's blood went cold. No one had called him by name in over a year, and the voice carried an authority that spoke of someone accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed. He motioned for Ruth and Walter to stay back as he approached the door. "Who's asking?" Conrad called back. "Marshal Tom Briggs from Copper Creek." Got business with you, Mackenzie. Conrad hesitated. A federal marshal meant serious legal trouble, but leaving someone to die in a blizzard went against everything he believed about mountain hospitality. After a moment's internal struggle, he opened the door. The man who stumbled inside was tall and lean, with ice coating his mustache and eyebrows. His badge was barely visible beneath layers of snow-covered clothing, but his bearing left no doubt about his profession. Marshal Briggs looked around the cabin with sharp eyes, taking note of Ruth and Walter with obvious surprise. "Wasn't expecting company," Briggs said, accepting the blanket Conrad offered and moving gratefully toward the fire. "Neither was I," Conrad replied carefully. "What brings a federal marshal to my door in weather like this?" Briggs pulled a folded paper from inside his coat, a wanted poster that had been protected from the elements. Conrad's stomach dropped as he recognized his own face staring back at him from the yellowed document. "Came across this in my office last week," Briggs said, holding up the poster. "Seems there's still a bounty on your head, Mackenzie." $500 for desertion and murder of a superior officer, Ruth gasped softly, her hand flying to her throat. Walter moved protectively closer to her wheelchair, his face pale with shock. Conrad felt the walls of his carefully constructed refuge crumbling around him. "Those charges are 15 years old," Conrad said quietly, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "Old doesn't mean forgotten," Briggs replied, studying Conrad's face carefully. "Murder charges don't have a statute of limitations." Conrad could feel Ruth and Walter's eyes on him, could sense their confusion and growing fear. In all their conversations, he had hinted at troubles with his commanding officer, but had never mentioned anything as serious as murder charges. "Marshal," Ruth said suddenly, her voice carrying the authoritative tone she had once used as a schoolteacher. "Surely you're not planning to drag a man out into a blizzard based on a 15-year-old accusation." Briggs looked surprised by her intervention. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but nothing," Ruth interrupted firmly. "I don't care what those papers say. The man who saved our lives and shared his home with us for months is not a murderer. There must be more to this story." Conrad felt a surge of gratitude so intense it nearly overwhelmed him. After learning he was wanted for murder, Ruth's first instinct was to defend him. It was more loyalty than he had received from anyone since the events that had driven him into exile. "She's right," Walter added, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "We've lived with Conrad for months now. We've seen his character, his kindness, his honor. Whatever happened 15 years ago, it wasn't murder." Briggs looked from Ruth to Walter to Conrad, clearly reassessing the situation. "You folks willing to stake your reputations on that assessment?" "Without hesitation," Ruth replied immediately. Conrad felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You don't know what you're saying," he told them quietly. "You don't know the whole story." "Then tell us," Walter said firmly. "Tell us what really happened." Conrad looked at the three faces watching him. Briggs with professional skepticism, Ruth and Walter with faith he wasn't sure he deserved. After 15 years of silence, the words came slowly, painfully. "Major Harrison was my commanding officer at Fort Collins. Good soldier in most ways, but he had a particular hatred for the Cheyenne that went beyond normal military necessity." Conrad's voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly as he continued. "We encountered a group of non-combatants, women, children, old men, traveling to the reservation. Harrison ordered us to attack them anyway." Briggs leaned forward, his expression growing more interested. "And you refused?" "I refused. So did most of my men. Harrison threatened court-martial for the lot of us if we didn't follow orders." Conrad paused, the memories as vivid as if they had happened yesterday. "That night Harrison came to my tent with his sidearm drawn, said he was going to shoot me as an example to the others, then lead the attack himself." "What happened?" Ruth asked softly. "We fought. In the struggle his gun went off and he was killed. My men reported it as I told them to, that Major Harrison had been killed by an Indian sniper during a night attack. But someone eventually talked, probably trying to reduce their own sentence for some unrelated charge." Briggs studied the wanted poster, then looked back at Conrad. "Any proof of this version of events?" The men who were there might testify, if any of them are still alive and you could find them. But most people would rather believe that a sergeant murdered his superior officer than that a major was planning to massacre civilians. The cabin fell silent, except for the howling wind outside. Briggs folded the wanted poster carefully and tucked it back into his coat. "Marshal," Ruth said carefully, "surely there's some way to investigate these claims properly? To give Conrad a chance to clear his name." Briggs looked at her with something approaching respect. "Ma'am, you seem like an educated woman. You understand how the legal system works? I taught school for 20 years and helped my husband with legal documents throughout our marriage. I understand enough. Then you know that sometimes the truth and legal reality are two different things. Even if Mackenzie's version is accurate, proving it after 15 years would be nearly impossible." Conrad felt his hopes, which had risen slightly during Ruth's questioning, crash back down. "So what happens now?" Briggs was quiet for a long moment, studying the three people watching him. "Well," he said finally, "I came up here in pursuit of a dangerous fugitive. But what I found was a man who's clearly become a productive member of his community, helping elderly folks who needed assistance. Doesn't match the profile of a cold-blooded killer." Walter leaned forward eagerly. "Does that mean—" "It means," Briggs interrupted, "that I'm going to recommend that the territorial governor review this case with fresh eyes. Might be that justice would be better served by investigating the original incident than by arresting a man who's clearly reformed. If he ever needed reforming in the first place." Conrad felt as if the weight of 15 years had suddenly lifted from his shoulders. "You'd do that? Even though there's a bounty?" Briggs smiled slightly. "Son, I've been wearing this badge for 23 years. I learned long ago that there's a difference between the law and justice, and sometimes a lawman has to choose which one he's going to serve." As the marshal settled in for the night, accepting their hospitality with the same grace Conrad had shown Ruth and Walter months earlier, the three friends looked at each other with a mixture of relief and amazement. The secret that Conrad had carried for 15 years was finally in the open, and instead of destroying their friendship, it had somehow made it stronger. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage, but inside the cabin, a man who had lived with shame and isolation for 15 years allowed himself for the first time to hope for a future that included both redemption and the family he had found in the most unlikely circumstances. The blizzard that had brought Marshal Briggs to their door raged for 4 days, during which the small cabin housed 4 people instead of 3. Despite the cramped conditions, the marshal's presence transformed the atmosphere in ways none of them had expected. Instead of the tension Conrad had feared, Briggs proved to be an engaging conversationalist with a wealth of stories from his years of law enforcement across the Colorado Territory. More importantly, the marshal spent considerable time questioning Conrad about the events that had led to his exile, taking careful notes and asking the kinds of detailed questions that suggested he was genuinely interested in uncovering the truth, rather than simply processing an arrest. "Tell me about the other men in your unit," Briggs said on the second evening, his notebook balanced on his knee as he sat by the fire. "The ones who witnessed what happened with Major Harrison." Conrad closed his eyes, summoning names and faces he had tried to forget. "Sergeant Murphy was my second in command. Good man from Irish stock, had a family back in Denver. Corporals Jenkins and Rodriguez were the most reliable soldiers I ever served with. Private Thompson was young, maybe 19, but steady under pressure." "Any of them still in the territory?" Briggs asked, making notes. Murphy was planning to homestead near Colorado Springs when his enlistment was up. That was 15 years ago, but he might still be there. "The others, I don't know." Ruth had been listening quietly from her wheelchair, her embroidery forgotten in her lap. "Marshal, how difficult would it be to track down these witnesses?" Briggs looked up from his notebook. "Challenging, but not impossible. Military records can tell us where they went after discharge, if they're still alive and willing to testify." Walter leaned forward in his chair, his carved chess piece momentarily forgotten. "And if they corroborate Conrad's story, Then we might have grounds for a formal review of the case, possibly even a complete exoneration." Briggs paused, studying Conrad's face. "But I have to warn you, Mackenzie, this process could take months, maybe years. And there's no guarantee of success." Conrad felt a familiar weight settling on his chest. 15 years of hiding had taught him to expect disappointment, to assume that hope would only lead to greater pain. "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime," Briggs said carefully, "I'm going to lose that wanted poster in my files and forget I ever made this trip. As far as anyone knows, I never found you." The relief that flooded through Conrad was so intense he had to grip the arms of his chair to remain steady. Ruth reached over and squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears of joy, but their celebration was interrupted by a more immediate crisis. On the third day of the storm, Walter collapsed while helping Conrad move firewood from the covered porch to the interior stack. One moment he was lifting a log, the next he was on the floor, his face grey and his breathing laboured. Conrad and Briggs carried him to his bed, while Ruth directed their efforts with the calm competence of someone who had dealt with medical emergencies before. But this episode was more severe than previous ones, and Walter's recovery was slower and less complete. "It's my heart," Walter admitted when he was finally able to speak clearly. "Been getting worse for months now. I didn't want to worry anyone." Ruth took his hand in both of hers, her voice gentle but firm. "Walter Dawson, after 43 years of marriage, do you really think you can hide something like that from me?" Walter managed a weak smile. "I should have known better." Marshal Briggs examined Walter with the practical medical knowledge he had acquired during his years of frontier law enforcement. His diagnosis was what they all feared. Walter's heart was failing, and the combination of altitude, cold, and physical stress was accelerating the condition. "He needs a doctor," Briggs said quietly to Conrad and Ruth when Walter had dozed off. "Someone with real medical training, not just frontier remedies." "The nearest doctor is in Copper Creek," Conrad replied. 25 miles through mountain terrain that's impossible to navigate in winter, especially with someone in Walter's condition. Ruth straightened in her wheelchair, her expression taking on the determined look that both men had learned to recognize. "Then we'll have to manage his care ourselves until spring." Over the following days, as the storm finally exhausted itself and clear weather returned, they reorganized their entire routine around Walter's needs. Conrad built him a more comfortable bed closer to the fireplace, with supports that would help him breathe more easily. Ruth researched every book in Conrad's collection that mentioned heart conditions, compiling a list of herbs and treatments that might help. Marshal Briggs, who had originally planned to leave as soon as the weather cleared, found reasons to extend his stay. Officially, he was stranded by dangerous trail conditions. Unofficially, he had been moved by the obvious devotion between Ruth and Walter, and by Conrad's transformation from a suspicious hermit into a caring family man. "I've been thinking," Briggs said one morning as he helped Conrad with the daily chores, "about what you folks are planning for spring." Conrad paused in his work of splitting kindling. "What do you mean?" "Well, if Walter's condition doesn't improve, and from what I've seen, it's more likely to get worse, you're going to need to make some difficult decisions. This cabin's isolated, and while it's comfortable, it's not ideal for someone who needs ongoing medical attention." The thought had been weighing on Conrad's mind for days, though he hadn't wanted to voice it aloud. Ruth and Walter had become his family, but keeping Walter comfortable and safe might require sacrifices he wasn't sure he was ready to make. "There's another option," Briggs continued. "I've got a house in Copper Creek that's been sitting empty since my wife passed 2 years ago. It's nothing fancy, but it's got room for 3 people, and Doc Peterson lives just 2 streets over." Conrad felt his chest tighten. "You're suggesting we move to town?" "I'm suggesting you consider what's best for all of you, not just what's comfortable." Briggs's voice was gentle but direct. "Walter needs medical care. Ruth would benefit from having other women to talk to after all these months with just you men for company. And you, well, you might find that civilization isn't as terrible as you remember." The conversation was interrupted by Ruth calling from inside the cabin. Walter had awakened and was asking for them, and when they rushed inside, they found him sitting up in bed with more alertness than he had shown in days. "I heard you talking," Walter said, his voice weak but determined. "About moving to town come spring." Conrad started to protest, but Walter held up a hand to stop him. "I've been thinking about the same thing," Walter continued. "Much as I love this place, and much as I appreciate everything you've done for us, Conrad, I know I'm going to need help that's beyond what we can manage up here." Ruth moved her wheelchair closer to his bedside. "We don't have to decide anything now, Walter. Let's see how you feel when the weather improves. Ruth, my dear, we both know I'm not going to improve. The question is whether I'm going to spend my remaining time making everyone around me miserable with worry, or whether I'm going to do what I can to ensure you have a good life after I'm gone." The stark honesty of Walter's words left them all momentarily speechless. Conrad felt a familiar sensation, the weight of impending loss, the knowledge that circumstances beyond his control were about to change everything he had come to value. "Walter," Conrad said quietly, "whatever you need, wherever you need to be, I'll make sure it happens." "That's a promise." Walter's eyes filled with tears. "And that's why I know Ruth will be all right, no matter what happens to me." Over the following week, as Walter's condition stabilized somewhat, they began to plan for multiple possibilities. If Walter improved enough to travel, they would consider moving to Copper Creek, where he could receive proper medical care. If he didn't improve, they would make the mountain cabin as comfortable as possible for whatever time remained, but underlying all their practical planning was an emotional reality they were only beginning to acknowledge. They had become a family in the truest sense, and whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Marshal Briggs finally prepared to leave on a crisp morning in early January, his investigation notes carefully packed and his promise to help clear Conrad's name renewed. But he left behind more than he took. He had given them hope for Conrad's legal redemption and practical options for their future that none of them had previously imagined. "Remember," Briggs said as he prepared to mount his horse, "my offer about the house in Copper Creek stands indefinitely. And Conrad, I'll be in touch as soon as I have news about those witnesses." As they watched the marshal disappear down the mountain trail, Conrad felt the weight of decisions that would need to be made in the coming months. His carefully ordered solitary life had been transformed beyond recognition, and now even greater changes loomed ahead. But for the first time in 15 years, those changes felt like opportunities rather than threats. Whatever the future held, he would face it not as a lonely fugitive, but as part of a family that had chosen to stand together through whatever storms might come. February arrived with deceptive mildness, bringing days of sunshine that made the snow sparkle like diamonds and raised everyone's spirits despite Walter's continuing decline. It was during one of these beautiful mornings that Conrad discovered Ruth hunched over his small writing desk, working intently on what appeared to be a lengthy document. "What are you writing?" Conrad asked, curious about her intense focus. Ruth looked up, her eyes bright with determination. "A formal petition to the territorial governor requesting a review of your case." Conrad felt his heart skip. "Ruth, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do," she interrupted firmly. "Marshal Briggs is doing what he can through official channels, but sometimes these matters require additional pressure from concerned citizens. I taught school for 20 years, Conrad. I know how to write a compelling argument." She held up several sheets of paper covered with her precise handwriting. "I've documented everything you told us about the incident with Major Harrison, cross-referenced it with what I could remember of territorial Indian policies from that period, and presented a case for why justice demands a thorough reinvestigation." Walter, who had been listening from his bed near the fireplace, managed a proud smile. "My wife has always been the smartest person in any room she enters. If anyone can clear your name on paper, it's Ruth." Conrad read through the petition, amazed by its thoroughness and persuasive power. Ruth had somehow managed to research legal precedents using his small collection of books, had cited relevant territorial statutes, and had presented his case with the skill of a trained lawyer. "This is remarkable," Conrad said, his voice thick with emotion. "But how do you know about territorial law?" Ruth's cheeks colored slightly. "I may not have mentioned this before, but I attended 2 years of normal school before I married Walter. I studied education, but also history, government, and basic legal principles. I always regretted not finishing, but frontier life had other demands." The revelation added another layer to Conrad's growing appreciation for Ruth's intellect and capabilities. In the months they had lived together, she had revealed depths of knowledge and skill that went far beyond what he had initially assumed about an elderly frontier woman. "There's something else," Ruth continued, pulling out another document. "I've also written to the newspaper in Denver, asking them to investigate the original incident. Sometimes public attention can accomplish what legal channels cannot." Conrad felt a mixture of hope and fear at Ruth's initiative. For 15 years, he had survived by remaining invisible, by ensuring that no one looked too closely at his past. Now Ruth was actively drawing attention to his case, betting everything on the truth being sufficient to clear his name. "What if you're wrong?" Conrad asked quietly. "What if the official investigation concludes that I really am guilty of murder?" Ruth met his eyes steadily. "Then we'll face that together as a family." "But I'm not wrong, Conrad. I've lived with you for months now. I've seen your character, your values, your instinctive protectiveness toward those weaker than yourself. You're not a murderer." Her absolute faith in his innocence was both humbling and terrifying. Conrad had spent so many years doubting himself, wondering if he could have handled the situation with Major Harrison differently, that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone believe in him completely. The peaceful morning was interrupted by the sound of multiple horses approaching the cabin. Conrad immediately reached for his rifle, his military instincts alerting him to potential danger. Through the window, he could see 3 riders emerging from the tree line, and his blood ran cold when he recognized the lead rider's bearing and equipment. "Bounty hunters," Conrad said grimly, checking his weapon and moving to a position where he could cover the door and windows. Walter struggled to sit up straighter in his bed, his face pale but determined. "How many?" "3 that I can see. Could be more hanging back in the trees." Conrad's voice was calm, but Ruth could hear the tension underneath. "Ruth, I need you to get behind the heavy table and stay down. Walter, can you handle a pistol if needed?" Walter nodded, accepting the sidearm Conrad handed him. Despite his physical weakness, his hands were steady and his eyes alert. "I may be dying, but I'm not dead yet," the lead bounty hunter called out from about 50 yards away. "McKenzie, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands up and nobody gets hurt." Conrad recognized the voice. Jake Morrison, a man with a reputation for bringing in his quarry dead as often as alive. The bounty hunters had obviously gotten word about his location, probably from someone who had heard Marshal Briggs making inquiries about the old case. "What do you want, Morrison?" Conrad called back. "You know what I want. $500. Says you're worth more to me unconscious than conversational." Ruth pulled herself as low as possible in her wheelchair, but her voice was steady when she whispered, "Conrad, the petition to the governor, it's already written and sealed. If something happens to us, someone needs to know that we tried to clear your name." Conrad felt a surge of love and gratitude for this remarkable woman who was still thinking about his redemption even as they faced mortal danger. In that moment, he realized that whatever happened in the next few minutes, Ruth and Walter had already given him something more valuable than legal vindication. They had given him back his faith in his own worth. "Nobody's dying today if I can help it," Conrad said firmly, his military training taking over as he prepared to protect the family he had found in the wilderness. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring for several minutes, with Conrad watching the bounty hunters through his rifle sights while they remained partially concealed behind trees and rocks. He could see Morrison gesturing to his companions, clearly planning their approach to the cabin. "Mackenzie," Morrison called again. "I'm giving you one more chance to come out peaceful-like. After that, we come in shooting." Conrad was calculating angles and distances, his military training automatically assessing the tactical situation, when Ruth's clear voice rang out across the clearing. "Mr. Morrison, this is Ruth Dawson. I believe you're making a terrible mistake." Conrad hissed in alarm. "Ruth, get down." But Ruth had positioned her wheelchair where she could be seen through the window, and she continued speaking in the authoritative tone she had once used to control unruly schoolchildren. "Mr. Morrison, I have here a formal petition to the territorial governor requesting a complete review of Mr. Mackenzie's case. New evidence has come to light that proves his innocence of the charges against him." Morrison's harsh laugh carried clearly in the thin mountain air. "Lady, I don't care if you've got a letter from President Cleveland himself. There's a bounty on this man's head, and I aim to collect it. Then you're going to have to go through 2 elderly people to get to him," Walter called out, his voice surprisingly strong despite his physical condition. "And I guarantee you that's going to complicate your legal position considerably." Conrad felt a surge of fierce pride in his adopted family. Even facing armed men who made their living through violence, Ruth and Walter were standing with him, using their intelligence and moral authority as weapons in his defense. Morrison's voice became more uncertain. "Look, folks, you seem like decent people. Just step aside and let us take Mackenzie, and nobody has to get hurt." "I'm afraid that's impossible," Ruth replied calmly. "You see, Mr. Mackenzie is our family now, and we don't abandon family members to injustice." It was at that moment that the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of another rider. Conrad's heart sank, assuming it was a 4th bounty hunter, but then he heard a familiar voice calling out with unmistakable authority, "This is Marshal Tom Briggs. Everyone lower your weapons." Morrison cursed violently, clearly recognizing the complication that official law enforcement represented. "Marshal, this man's a wanted fugitive. We've got legal right to bring him in." Briggs rode into the clearing, his badge clearly visible and his own rifle held ready. "Morrison, you and your boys need to mount up and ride out now, like hell. There's a $500 bounty." "There was a $500 bounty," Briggs interrupted firmly. "As of yesterday, Conrad McKenzie has been officially exonerated of all charges by the territorial governor. The bounty is void." Conrad felt the world tilt beneath him. "Exonerated?" Briggs reached into his coat and pulled out an official-looking document. "Found 3 of your old unit members, Mackenzie. Sergeant Murphy, Corporal Jenkins, and Private Thompson. All 3 gave sworn statements corroborating your version of events. Turns out Major Harrison had a history of similar incidents that the Army had covered up." Ruth let out a cry of joy, tears streaming down her face. Walter managed to sit up straighter, his eyes bright with triumph despite his physical weakness. Morrison's face was dark with rage. "That paper could be a forgery." "How do we know?" "Because," Briggs said coldly, "questioning the authenticity of official territorial documents is a federal offense. And because I've got backup coming up the trail who can verify everything I've told you," as if summoned by his words. 2 more riders appeared at the edge of the clearing, deputy marshals who flanked Morrison and his companions with professional efficiency. Faced with overwhelming official authority, the bounty hunters had no choice but to withdraw. Morrison cast one last venomous look at the cabin before spurring his horse down the mountain trail, his companions following reluctantly. Briggs dismounted and approached the cabin, his face wreathed in a broad smile. "Conrad McKenzie, it's my honor to inform you that you're officially a free man. All charges have been dropped, and there's even talk of a commendation for your service record." Conrad emerged from the cabin on unsteady legs, hardly able to believe what he was hearing. 15 years of exile, of shame, of living with the weight of false accusations. It was finally over. Ruth wheeled herself out onto the porch, still clutching the petition she had written. "Marshal, how did you manage to find the witnesses so quickly?" Briggs grinned and held up a familiar-looking document. Well, ma'am, it helped considerably that I received a very persuasive petition from a certain schoolteacher, along with a newspaper article that raised some uncomfortable questions about the original investigation. Sometimes public pressure can work miracles. Walter appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on the frame, but beaming with pride. I told you my wife was the smartest person in any room, as the three of them stood together on the porch of the cabin that had sheltered them through the darkest winter of their lives. Conrad realized that his freedom was only part of the gift he had received. More than legal vindication, more than the lifting of old shame. He had found something he had thought lost forever, a family that believed in him completely and had been willing to fight for his redemption, even when he had given up on himself. The sun was setting behind the mountain peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and rose. And for the first time in 15 years, Conrad McKenzie watched it set as a truly free man. Spring came early to the Colorado mountains that year, arriving in March with warm winds that turned the snow to rushing streams and coaxed the first tentative buds from the aspen trees. The transformation of the landscape seemed to mirror the changes taking place in the lives of the three people who had weathered the winter together in Conrad's cabin. Walter's condition had stabilized somewhat with the warmer weather, though everyone understood that his improvement was temporary at best. Rather than dwelling on the limitations his failing heart imposed, he had thrown himself into a final project that would serve as his legacy, designing and beginning construction of a larger cabin that could accommodate all three of them permanently. If we're going to be a proper family, Walter had announced one morning in April, we need a proper family home. The site he had chosen was a natural clearing about a quarter-mile from Conrad's original cabin, with southern exposure for maximum sunlight and protection from the prevailing winds. Working together, he and Conrad had spent weeks planning every detail of the construction, creating something that would be both beautiful and functional for decades to come. Ruth had insisted on being involved in every aspect of the planning, contributing ideas for the kitchen design, the placement of windows, and the creation of spaces that would accommodate her wheelchair while still feeling like a real home, rather than a modified shelter. I want wide doorways and gentle ramps, she had said, sketching modifications to Walter's plans. But I also want crown molding and proper wainscoting. Just because something is practical doesn't mean it can't be beautiful. Conrad had thrown himself into the project with an enthusiasm that surprised even him. After 15 years of building only for solitary survival, he found deep satisfaction in creating something designed for shared living, for community, for the kind of life he had thought permanently beyond his reach. The foundation stones had been laid in late April, each one carefully selected and positioned according to Walter's precise specifications. Conrad had insisted that Walter's name be carved into the cornerstone, along with the date and a simple inscription, built with love for the family we chose. As spring progressed into early summer, their plans for the future crystallized around several key decisions. Conrad's legal exoneration had made it possible for him to travel freely, to re-enter society if he chose, but none of them had any desire to abandon the mountain life that had brought them together. Marshal Briggs had made several visits throughout the spring, ostensibly to check on their progress, but actually because he had grown genuinely fond of all three of them. His offer of the house in Copper Creek remained open, but it had evolved into something different, a winter residence where they could stay during the harshest months, ensuring Walter access to medical care while allowing them to spend the warmer seasons in their mountain home. Best of both worlds. Briggs had said during his last visit in May, mountain living when the weather's good, town conveniences when you need them. Ruth had embraced this plan enthusiastically. The prospect of having other women to talk to during the winter months appealed to her, as did the opportunity to contribute to the community as a teacher or tutor. Several families in Copper Creek had already expressed interest in her educational services, but it was a letter that arrived in early June that truly settled their future arrangements. The territorial governor himself had written to Conrad, not only confirming his complete exoneration, but offering him a position as a federal liaison for wilderness conservation efforts in the Colorado Territory. The position would be perfect for you, Ruth had said after reading the letter aloud. You'd be protecting the wilderness you love while using your knowledge to help others appreciate and preserve it. Conrad had accepted the position, which would allow him to remain based in the mountains while occasionally traveling to advise on land management and conservation issues. It was exactly the kind of meaningful work he had dreamed of during his years of exile, and it paid well enough to ensure their small family's financial security. As summer reached its peak, Walter completed the final piece of his legacy, a beautifully carved wooden sign for their new cabin that read simply, "The McKenzie Dawson Home." Conrad had tried to object to having his name first, but Walter had been adamant. "You gave us shelter when we had nothing," Walter had said. "This will always be your home first, even if we've made it ours as well." The new cabin was completed in August, a spacious structure with wide porches, large windows, and all the accessibility features Ruth needed while maintaining the rustic elegance that Walter had envisioned. Conrad had added his own touches, built-in bookshelves, a workshop area, and a stone fireplace designed for both heating and cooking. On the evening they moved into their new home. The three of them sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and purple. Walter was noticeably weaker than he had been in the spring, but his eyes were bright with contentment as he looked around at what they had built together. "You know," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air, "when our old cabin burned down, I thought we'd lost everything that mattered. Turns out we'd just cleared space for something better." Ruth reached over and took his hand, her own eyes misty with emotion. "We found our real family, didn't we? Not the one we were born into, but the one we chose." Conrad felt his throat tighten with gratitude as he looked at these two remarkable people who had transformed his life so completely. "I spent 15 years thinking I was being punished for something I'd done wrong," he said. "Turns out I was just being prepared for something I was meant to do right." As the stars emerged in the clear mountain sky, Walter pulled a letter from his pocket, one he had been writing to his grandson back east, describing their extraordinary winter and the family they had created together. "I want him to know," Walter said, "that sometimes the best things in life come when you're not looking for them. And that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about people who choose to stand by each other when everything else falls apart." The letter would be mailed the next morning, carrying their story beyond the mountains to family members who would read it with amazement and joy. But tonight, it was enough to sit together on the porch of the home they had built with their own hands, watching the peaceful darkness settle over the wilderness that had given them refuge and allowed them to discover that it's never too late to find your way home.